You probably have seen this Truth Social post that has now been tweeted out by Donald Trump calling Zelensky a modestly successful comedian who took 350 billion US dollars. And now he's talking about how he is essentially an unelected dictator under martial law who refuses to have elections. This is a huge shift, this rhetoric and approach. There was the summit in Riyadh with Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff meeting with Lavrov and Russia's team. There's also been media of Donald Trump commenting on the situation with regard to Ukraine, where he says it is not a Russian policy to call for elections in Ukraine, but a U.S. one. Here we go.
We're hearing that Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
We haven't had elections in Ukraine. Well, we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine. The leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating. Most of the cities are laying on their sides. The buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. They haven't done it in Kiev because I guess they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. They've done it 20%, but they haven't done it 100%. If they wanted to do it 100%, it would probably happen very quickly. But you have cities that are absolutely decimated. I would say that, when they want a seat at the table, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, it's been a long time since we've had an election? That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
What I believe is that Donald Trump definitely wants this conflict to end. How that happens, I think, is still up in question. What's your thoughts?
Well, it's all about China, as is always the case. The central tenet of not only Trump's foreign policy, but also Biden's and in general U.S. foreign policy is trying to contain and weaken China. Unfortunately, we're in a new Cold War. And what Trump has been trying to do since his first term is what people call a reverse Kissingerian strategy. So in the 1970s, going back to 1971, Kissinger went to China, and then in 1972, Nixon went to China, and they normalized relations with the People's Republic as an attempt to try to weaken the Soviet Union. And this has been a call for a decade now. They want to do the same, but with Russia. They want to soften tensions with Russia, and they want to try to isolate China. Now, I don't think the strategy is going to work, but they've been very open about it. In fact, in October, Donald Trump did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and he said, China and Russia should not be united. He said, I'm going to ununite them. I think I can do it. And if you listen to the speech that Marco Rubio gave in Saudi Arabia at this meeting where he also was with, Mike Waltz, who's another hawk, he's a national security advisor, and they met with their Russian counterparts, including the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. In the speech, Marco Rubio said that the U.S. wants to collaborate with Russia geopolitically. I mean, a lot of people were surprised by this. They're like, wow, this is not just trying to pursue peace in Ukraine. The U.S. is saying we want to collaborate with Russia. But what is left unspoken is they expect Russia to go along with them to isolate China. China is, of course, Russia's most important partner. Putin is very smart. Lavrov is brilliant. They know what the U.S. is trying to do. And in fact, Putin acknowledged this when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. We all know that Carlson is very close to Trump. He's whispering in Trump's ear. And Carlson asked Putin about this in an interview they did last year in Moscow. And Tucker Carlson basically said to Putin, China's taking over. They're going to control you. They're going to control BRICS. And Putin said, this is a bogeyman story. He said, this is a fairy tale. It's not true. And he said, China's our neighbor. We have a long history going back thousands of years. They've never invaded us. And Putin told Tucker Carlson, which was really a way of him telling Trump, he said, you're hurting yourself by being so aggressive against China and trying to isolate China. So everything that's happening is about China. It's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is of no concern to Trump. I mean, we've seen that. And what we also have seen is that we now know who was really waging this war. So many people are angry that Ukraine was not invited because we now know that as you and I and critics have said from the beginning, this was not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This was a war between Russia and NATO led by the United States. So this is why Trump is dispelling all illusions and saying, no, it's the US and Russia that have been in this proxy war, and we're going to negotiate now. Now, there are a few other elements I think we should consider here. Of course, the China element is the most important, but there's also what the U.S. is doing to Ukraine, which is incredible. I mean, it's horrible. Obviously, the U.S. has been pushing Ukraine into the line of fire from the very beginning, and Trump blames Zelensky, but he really should be blaming the United States. It was Obama, and then Trump himself escalated the conflict in his first term, and then Biden. It's the United States that bears responsibility for this war, but of course he just blames Zelensky. But it's not just that. Trump is now trying to impose economic colonialism on Ukraine. In fact, it's so blatant, it's so bad that even the Telegraph, the mainstream British newspaper, referred to it as economic colonialism. What am I talking about? So people have been focused on the negotiations between the US and Russia, but Trump is also trying to force Ukraine to sign a deal that would give the US total control over Ukraine's minerals, and it has trillions of dollars worth of minerals. And we see, US politicians like Lindsey Graham have constantly said this openly. They say, we want to get the trillions of dollars of minerals in Ukraine. Also, this deal that Trump's trying to impose would give the U.S. control over Ukraine's oil and gas. It would give the U.S. control over Ukraine's ports and strategic infrastructure. And according to this U.S. plan, Trump wants to be paid back $500 billion from Ukraine. And he says that the U.S. needs to be paid back for all the money that it gave to Ukraine. Now, you and I have obviously been critics of all of the billions and billions of dollars that the US and Europe have flooded into Ukraine. But the total figure, including the US and all of NATO, all of Europe, is around 200 billion. The US has sent over 100 billion, but Trump wants to be paid back 500 billion. This is just mafia behavior. And he also, according to this plan, he wants to force the Ukrainian regime to sign a deal that says that 50% of all future revenues from the export of minerals and oil and gas will go to the United States. I mean, this is mafia behavior. And mainstream journalists have pointed out that if this deal were pushed through and Trump is demanding it, Ukraine will be forced to pay more to the US as a percentage of GDP than Germany was forced to pay in the reparations imposed in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And we all know what happened in Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. Hyperinflation, the destruction of the economy, the end of the German Republic, and of course, eventually the rise of fascism. I mean, there's no shortage of fascists in Ukraine. But I mean, this is what the U.S. so-called ally, friend, does to Ukraine. It's amazing. I mean, this really gives truth to this famous Kissinger quote that being an enemy of the United States is dangerous. Being a friend is fatal. I mean, right. The U.S. has destroyed Ukraine. The U.S. pushed Ukraine into this war. The U.S. backed the coup in 2014 that overthrew Ukraine's neutral, democratically elected leader, Viktor Yanukovych. The U.S. pushed Ukraine into this proxy war against Russia. And now Trump says, give us all your natural resources and infrastructure. It's really incredible. And the real message you should get out of this, the entire world, and I think a lot of countries are, is that you can never trust the United States. Why would anyone in a million years trust the United States? And it's also why I don't think Trump will be successful in trying to get Russia to just break its most important partnership with China and put all of its eggs in the U.S. basket. It's never going to happen because Russia knows that the U.S. can't be trusted. Look what they just did to Ukraine. And of course, we know that, Putin has said this for over a decade. And when Putin came in, originally, the irony is that the West thought he would be a more competent version of Boris Yeltsin, who was just a complete clown and an alcoholic. Putin was supposed to integrate Russia into the West, but as an unequal partner, subservient. And Putin, as a nationalist, said, no, we do not want to be subservient. We want to be at an equal level with the West. And they refused that. They only were allowing Russia to integrate on terms that were against the Russian people, that were on behalf of Western oligarchs and Western capital. And Putin said no. And he gave his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference saying that, the U.S. is trying to seek hegemony and we need, you already saw kind of the early talk of a multipolar world back then, which is 15 years ago. So well over 17, 18 years ago now. So Putin has made that very clear that he knows the West can't be trusted. Trump thinks that he can just force every country to do whatever he wants because he thinks the U.S. has all this leverage. Look at the way he talks about, tariffs, saying that, oh, they'll do what I want. we'll control the Panama Canal, we'll colonize Greenland, we'll control Gaza. He overestimates the power of the US. He thinks it's the 1990s still. But what we really see is that, this is not about peace, really. This is about trying to end the conflict in Ukraine so the US can focus on China. This is this is not just Trump. This is going back to Obama and the Hillary Clinton State Department's declaration of the pivot to Asia. They never were really able to pivot to Asia because then the U.S. waged all of these wars in Syria and Libya and Yemen and so many other conflicts, the proxy war in Ukraine. But now Trump is really saying, yes, we're going to end this conflict and we're going to move troops to the Pacific to prepare for war on China.
Many people are very hopeful. There are, of course, many who are critical, but there are many who are very hopeful about what is going on. And in many respects, I can't blame people for being hopeful because it's almost surreal to see the Trump administration behave in the way it is right now. You could say they almost looked diplomatic in Riyadh. I mean, guys like Rubio, people that we have chewed up many times in the past, talking in a way where everything that the U.S. is promising to do, even just now, opening up diplomatic channels and whatnot, is what a lot of people want to hear because a lot of people want this to end. But here's what Rubio had to say, especially about sanctions, that I would like your comment on.
Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict. There are sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict. And so I would say to you that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. We're not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. And there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed.
On the one hand, I see this as an admission of defeat. Trump is saying it's Europe's fault, it's Zelensky's fault. Now we're going to get closer to Russia. And that, on the one hand, is a welcome development. But on the other hand, there is this kind of distorted thinking of the U.S. as peacemaker. I'm curious on how you would respond to those who are feeling very hopeful about this moment.
Well, we shouldn't be naive. Again, this is all about China. Let's not be naive. Marco Rubio is not suddenly a dove. I mean, this guy has been a lifelong warmonger and neoconservative. And he simply has said that our main priority is not Russia, it's China. He said this for years. I mean, I recently did a video. I went back and looked at some speeches that Marco Rubio gave several years ago. And he constantly says, China, 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 China is our biggest threat. He said, China is the greatest threat the United States has ever faced, ever, he said, in history. He said China is a much greater threat than the Soviet Union was. Of course, the Soviet Union was never an actual threat to the U.S., but that's what they're claiming. And Marco Rubio's argument is that the Soviet Union was only a so-called military threat and a security threat to the U.S., whereas China, according to Rubio, is a so-called military, economic, technology threat, a threat in every single realm. And of course, China has the world's largest economy since 2016, when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity. China is the world's largest manufacturing power. Russia has a significant military force. Russia does have some advanced manufacturing capabilities, but, China is just a whole other level. China's population is 14 times that of Russia. China's economy is significantly larger. China produces everything in the entire world. The entire supply chain is located in China. So the U.S., and especially people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Trump, are focused on trying to weaken China. And they've made the assessment that they lost. I agree with you. They lost the war in Ukraine. This is them acknowledging that. And they're saying that we need to end this conflict to focus all of our attention on trying to weaken China. Donald Trump said this in an interview with Tucker Carlson. He's not hiding it. This is very blatant. And ironically, in his first term, Trump wanted to do all of this, but it was Russiagate that prevented him from doing it, right? It was this ridiculous conspiracy spread by the Democrats that Trump was a Putin puppet. It's nonsense. He was never a Putin puppet. He said it very clearly. Steve Bannon said it very clearly. Even Kissinger, back in his first term, were saying, you should improve relations with Russia in order to isolate China. This is not about peace. The U.S. has never pursued peace. This is about imperialism. And Marco Rubio and Trump have a worldview that is about imperial spheres of influence. That's the way they see the world. Now, Marco Rubio gave this interview recently with Megyn Kelly, and in it, he acknowledged that the world is multipolar. And some Trump supporters took that out of context and claimed that suddenly Marco Rubio, this lifelong neoconservative warmonger, has turned a new leaf and supposedly is acknowledging that the U.S. can no longer be an empire. It's the opposite. If you listen to the speech, the full interview, and if you listen to other speeches that Marco Rubio has given, including in a video I did, I looked at a speech back in 2022 where he made the same comments about how we're in a multipolar world. It's not because he wants peace. When the U.S. talks about multipolarity, it's the opposite of what China means. When China talks about multipolarity, they mean a world without imperialism and hegemony. They mean a world in which all countries have equal opportunities to have their voice heard in international institutions and multilateral institutions. They mean a world in which all countries, regardless of size, are equal, and other large powers, imperial powers, cannot control and dominate what happens. For instance, what Trump is trying to do in Panama or in Mexico or in Greenland, right? And Marco Rubio's view of multipolarity is very different. Rubio says the U.S. is no longer the unipolar power that it was in the 90s, which is not a controversial observation. Everyone knows that. The U.S. can't control the entire world anymore. So Rubio and their conclusion is that the U.S. must reassert its hegemonic control over its imperial spheres of influence. This is why they've been reinvoking the colonial Monroe Doctrine, which is already 202 years old. It's why they're so aggressive in Latin America, in Panama, forcing Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to take control of the Panama Canal. They're trying to colonize Greenland. They're threatening to invade Mexico. They're even threatening Canada. They're now talking about colonizing Gaza. This is all about expanding U.S. imperialism, but they're recognizing that the U.S. can't control the entire world. So they're saying Ukraine is an issue of Europe. The way they see it is Ukraine is part of Russia's sphere of influence. It's a European issue. It's not our issue. The U.S. is going to reassert its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and in the Pacific, because they also see the Pacific as part of the imperial sphere of influence of the United States. So they're, again, going to focus on the pivot to Asia and trying to isolate China. And Trump says, I don't really care about Ukraine. The Democrats were, focused on maintaining U.S. full spectrum dominance over the entire world. That wasn't going to work. Our focus is imperial spheres of influence where we think it's most important to us.
I'll pull up what Rubio said in a recent interview with Megyn Kelly on this question of multipolarity. America first. This was a comment. And then he responds, and I'll just read. He said, "It's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to have to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multiple great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent Russia, and then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with." What I've been seeing is that Trump, in the Trump administration, all players, including people like Rubio, are saying and framing things in a way that I believe are leading people to the conclusion that they are genuinely for peace now. I think there's a narrative too that Trump has wrangled them. And now, as you've seen in comments, Russia, China, and the U.S. will all cut our military budgets together. We'll make China and the United States will have a wonderful relationship under me. This is Donald Trump. So how do you respond to that? People want to feel hope, but at the same time, again, we are in the realm of rhetoric here. And is there a different reality that we need to be seeing?
Yeah, it's rhetoric. Trump. Do people not know who Donald Trump is? He has, for decades, always said these bombastic things that never happen. He said, I'm going to make Mexico I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. That never happened. He constantly says things like this. There's never going to happen. There's never going to be a deal in which the U.S., China, and Russia get together and agree to reduce their military budgets. And by the way, even if they all reduce their budgets, the U.S. would still be spending more than China and Russia and 7 other countries combined. I mean, because if they all reduce their military spending proportionately, the U.S. is still spending way more than them. It's not going to happen. It's just another thing that Trump says it's never going to happen. He loves to float out these kinds of things. I will say, I'm speaking to you here from Beijing, and from a lot of people I've spoken with in China, no one believes Trump on this rhetoric. They know that he's full of BS, and they're all preparing for more aggressive U.S. policies, more tariffs, more sanctions, more different attacks. We saw recently that the State Department under Marco Rubio removed text saying that it opposes independence for Taiwan extremists. So I mean, they're preparing for conflict. The U.S. is preparing for conflict with China. And, you know, people say, okay, well, Trump put tariffs on Taiwan. Well, Trump's putting tariffs on people everywhere. I mean, this is not surprising to me. Trump's worldview is a colonial worldview. Now, of course, all U.S. presidents are imperialists. I'm not trying to say that, you know, Joe Biden was a lesser evil, or, I mean, they're all war criminals. Biden was a horrific war criminal who should go to The Hague. And of course, Netanyahu is wanted at The Hague, but Biden should also be, because he's the one who armed Netanyahu as he carried out those crimes against humanity in Gaza. It's true for Bush, certainly, the Iraq War. It's true for Obama, the war on Libya, the war in Syria. But Trump is no exception. The people pretending that Trump is an exception are very naive, and they're believing his propaganda, which has always been fake. Look back at Trump's first term. He killed Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. He killed a top Iraqi commander. He refused to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq. He boasted of stealing Syria's oil. He threatened sanctions on Iraq after Iraq's parliament voted to expel U.S. troops. They're still there. He expanded the war in Yemen and massively expanded U.S. drone strikes in Yemen. He waged a proxy war, an indirect war against Venezuela, trying to destroy Venezuela. I mean, there are so many things. He backed coups in Bolivia, a coup attempt in Nicaragua. It was very violent. Trump is not any different. His rhetoric is different, though. That is a difference. So other U.S. presidents, especially Democrats, love to talk about human rights and democracy, which is obviously bogus. It's PR. It's propaganda. Trump dispels all of that. This is why in his first term, it was Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, who famously said that Trump has taken off the mask on the United States and showed the true face of the U.S. And I agree. Trump is the true face of the U.S. empire. They no longer pretend to care about human rights and democracy. Trump is explicitly colonial. He doesn't hide it. He says, we are going to expand the territory of the U.S. empire. He said that in his inauguration speech. He invoked manifest destiny, which is a colonialist doctrine. He said repeatedly, including on the 25th of January at a rally, at an event in Las Vegas, he said, very soon we're going to vastly expand the territory of the United States. He wants to colonize Greenland, to take over the rare earths and very profitable minerals in Greenland. And also, when Marco Rubio, in that interview with Megyn Kelly, was asked about Greenland, what did he say? China, 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 China. By the way, in this speech that Trump supporters are quoting to claim that neocon, the king of the neocons, Marco Rubio, supposedly is now a dove, in that speech, he mentioned the words China or Chinese 65 times in 1 hour, 65 times. The entire interview, if you actually listen to it, which I did, all of it, and not just one little clip, the entire interview is about how the U.S. is no longer the only single imperial power in the way he sees it, and that he sees China as a huge threat to U.S. imperial dominance. So the U.S. must get involved in a great power competition, as he puts it, with China to weaken China. That's what the entire thing's about. He was asked about the Panama Canal, and he says, we have to control the Panama Canal because supposedly China controls it, which is not true. We have to control Greenland, as he says, to prevent China from getting access to the Arctic. He was asked about why the U.S. wants Greenland, and immediately he said, China, 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 China. This is not about peace. This is about expanding the U.S. empire's hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And Donald Trump, he issued an executive order praising William McKinley. And, a lot of people have talked about this because Trump's, he loves tariffs. He said tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. And in this executive order, he praises McKinley for his tariffs. However, if you read the full executive order, he also praises McKinley for expanding the territory of the United States. For Trump, this is very important. He wants to expand the U.S. empire physically, whereas previous presidents preferred having what was called an informal empire, right? Where the U.S. is a series of puppet regimes like the Jordanian monarchy, right? These obedient puppet leaders who will do whatever the U.S. wants. Trump dispels that and says, no, we want to directly colonize and control territories like Greenland, like Panama, like Gaza, and who knows what will be next on his list? Canada. He wants to make it the 51st state. So William McKinley, when he was president, what happened? He colonized Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii. And that's why Trump thinks he was a great president, because he expanded the physical territory of the US empire. So the thing, Trump's view is that we have to reduce tensions with Russia. We don't want a war with Russia. And I don't think he wants a direct war with China, because people know that would probably be a nuclear war. So instead, his whole argument is that we have to get engaged in this imperial competition, in scare quotes, with China, where the US can just bully and colonize small countries that can't defend themselves, because Russia and China can defend themselves. So Gaza can't defend itself. Greenland can't defend itself. Panama can't defend itself. So the US wants to take them over. But Russia can push back, and China can certainly push hard. So Trump is saying, okay, fine, we're going to focus on simply expanding our imperial power.